Welcome to another training. Today we have the lovely Megan Sullivan with us to share about possibly the worst part of your job, inspection responses. Not much else to say except that tomorrow we are having a training on lending. This is a lender who I actually haven't met in person. I don't know if any of you guys use Susan Nemeth. She's with Cafe Lending. I adore her. I have met her in person. She actually, she takes me out to lunch sometimes, and I always go to Yukio because it is the best restaurant in Indianapolis, except that it's closed right now, but when it opens, go there. Anyway, Susan hates talking in front of people, so she was like, can I introduce you to my colleague, Katrina, and she'll do the lending training for you. So we have someone named Katrina. She works with GVC Mortgage coming tomorrow. So hope you can make it. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Megan, and she is going to rock your socks off. Megan, before you dive into inspection responses, can you tell us a little bit about you, how long you've been in real estate and at Platt, where you live, what's your dog's name, the whole shebang.
He might make an appearance. We'll see. So thank you. I have, it's great to see you guys. I know I haven't met a lot of you, most of you. So this is exciting. I've been in real estate now. I'm finishing up my 8th year. So heading into year 9. I've been with Platt 3.5 of those, I think. So I started my career at Carpenter, much different situation, big corporate model, and moved to Platt a few years ago. So I am a lifetime Near East Sider. I live in Windsor Park and grew up in Woodruff and Irvington. So always been kind of an East Side girl. And I have been in this house for about 10 years. And my dog Finnegan is here. And like I said, he might appear, he might bark, you never know. But when it comes to real estate, I'm to a point now where most of my business is repeat and referral. So geographically, I'm kind of all over the city, but I would say I sell more old houses than newer houses. So I've had my share of crazy fun inspection response situations. And my business is about half and half, listings and buyers. So kind of on either side of that transaction at any given time. And I work by myself. I'm not part of a team. So by choice, that's how I do my business. So I'm going to jump right in. If you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt me, or I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, or Rosie will interrupt, I'm sure. I think this is a topic that we could talk about for much more than an hour. And I'm not going to I don't want to drone on and put you all to sleep, but Rosie asked me to really tailor this to sort of newly out of licensing realtors that haven't done this a lot. So if this is too elementary for some of you, I apologize. But my thought was we'll start with some real basics on the forms and the language in the purchase agreement, quickly go through some of that, and then talk more about best practices and strategies and so forth. So kind of to start, I think it's important to say, why do we do this? What's the purpose of an inspection? And I think it's important to remember that the point is to protect your buyer from a major problem, and a problem that typically can't be seen on a normal showing or can't be seen by a layman. The purpose is not to deliver your buyer a perfect home. So I think a really important part of our job is to manage that expectation, to set that expectation early. And for example, I don't think the first conversation about inspection should be after you're in a purchase agreement. For me, I'm talking about inspection from buyer consult, as we look at houses, as we write the purchase agreement, so that by the time we're actually doing it, it's not new to them. It's not new to buyers, especially first-time home buyers, of course. That's going to be the biggest category of people with a lot of questions about this. But even some of your older folks, this process has changed a lot in the last few decades. I know my mom is always listening to my stories, and she's like, wasn't like this. We just walked through a house and we bought it. So, things have evolved in the industry. And so even if someone has done this before, it may be a different process for them now. So I'm gonna share my screen, maybe. I really am gonna figure this out, I promise. Not that window. This one. So, okay. First of all, just the language in the purchase agreement. Hopefully you guys are all semi-familiar with this. What happens? So you sign a contract, your buyer's all excited, and now the next step is inspection. They have the right to have inspections. I just want to point out, obviously, I think you probably know the cost of that inspection is on the buyer, but that includes additional testing as well. Like basically any investigating is on the responsibility of the buyer, at least in our market. I'll give you an example. I recently had a situation where an inspection report said, hey, this house is 100 years old, the plumbing's old, you should run a camera down the sewer line. Absolutely. The buyer asked the seller to do that. Seller was like, no, like they want to do that, they can do that, but the seller's not necessarily going to take responsibility for that. So just keep that in mind as you're going. Again, a seller might, but most typically in our market, that's not going to happen. So the investigating, any cost associated with that, probably going to fall to your buyer. And then the big section, starting on line 198 of your purchase agreement, I personally think this is the most important information or language in our purchase agreement. And I think more deals fall apart on inspection than probably anything else. And so I think it's really important that you read it and understand it. And that might sound silly, but I've encountered situations with other agents when they don't necessarily get it. So make sure you understand what it says. And that is basically that obviously a buyer has the right to have a home inspected within a certain amount of time. But the thing I really want to call your attention to is line 221. A buyer has to give a seller the opportunity to remedy a defect. So what does that mean? You take your young buyers through a 1920s home, it comes back with an 80-page inspection report, and they are flipping out and they want out. If you just send that seller a mutual release and do not send them an inspection response, your earnest money is definitely in jeopardy. So it's real clear, most simple sentence there. You have to give the seller the opportunity to remedy the defect. So you have to send them an inspection response. And then if they don't agree to it, you can discuss whether or not a mutual release makes sense. But I've only been to court once as a realtor. And it was this exact scenario. I represented the seller and they kept the earnest money. The judge ruled that way. So I'm confident that this is an important thing and that it's true. So just keep that in mind. Even if a buyer really thinks they want out of a deal, you still have to. Now you can write a crazy inspection response to so-called kill the deal, but you do need to send an inspection response. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but use caution with that because you don't want to ever admit you're trying to kill a deal with an inspection response. That's important. Same thing, you could risk your earnest money. So it's also really clear here that if you look at line 229 and 230, anything previously disclosed cannot be a reason for a buyer to exit the contract. So what that means basically is if on the seller's disclosure, they've said there's termite damage, you can still ask a seller to fix that termite damage, but they've already told you it's there. You knew it was there when you signed the seller's disclosure. And so you can't use that as a reason, a defect to exit the contract. It's also pretty clear right there in line 230 that any minor repair items, routine maintenance stuff, not a reason to exit. So you just want to be careful on your not nitpicking, going after those little things. So that's kind of just the basics, the highlights I wanted to pull out of the actual contract language. The next thing I wanted to just point out quickly is talk about the inspection response forms. So there has been some chatter on our Plat Collective Facebook page. So I know that some Plat agents have been burned by this. These forms do not function like a purchase agreement and a counteroffer in a couple different ways. So you know that when you write a purchase agreement, You send it to a seller and the seller sends you a counter offer. And that counter offer only mentions price and closing date, for example. That means that the seller is agreeing to everything in the purchase agreement and only changing those 2 terms. That is not how this works at all on inspection. So whatever's on the inspection response form from the seller is what the seller is willing to do. So if I send a list of 8 items to a seller and their response form comes back with 5, they are not doing the 3 they did not mention. They are only doing what's on their form. And the reason I wanted to emphasize this is, like I said, I know plat agents have learned this the hard way. Lots of agents have learned this the hard way and had to pay for repairs because they didn't understand that. So that's really important. I'm going to talk a little later about how important I think it is to be very, very specific in your request as far as what you ask for in repairs. And I've got some examples of that. But while I have
Megan,
the foreman, yeah.
Can you hit that again? Just like you have to write out what you want in an inspection response. That's what you're saying, right?
Right. So as a buyer's agent, I'm gonna say I want exactly what I want done. I want the seller to do or make some concession for these 5 things: electrical, plumbing, roof, and gutters, and mold. If the seller comes back and says, I will do electrical, plumbing, and mold, that's all they're doing. By not mentioning the other 2 items, they are not doing them. And so you just have to remember that it's different than a purchase agreement. Does that make sense?
And Megan, yeah, thank you. You had a question come in from Eduardo. He said, this is from just a tad earlier. He said, what about when the seller's disclosure is marked don't know versus a concrete yes or no? And Eduardo, I'm not sure if you had more of a question there or if Megan, you understand.
I understand, yeah. And my interpretation of that would be that they have not disclosed a defect at that point. So if they don't know, they're not telling you there's a problem. So if they've marked don't know, I think then you would still have grounds to use that item in an inspection response. And again, if they've disclosed it, you can still ask for them to fix it. You just can't break a contract based on that if they won't fix it because they've told you up front. Okay, so scrolling down in this form, the other thing I want to call your attention to is lines 35 through 37. So this is a little different than a purchase agreement as well. On a purchase agreement, when we fill in the response dates, there's a time and a date. And here you just have this open field. And most agents will just put in a date. So they'll say, I would like a response by February 3rd. When you do that, and that's fine, you're absolutely allowed to do that. But when you do that, that means 11:59 p.m. tonight. So what I like to do is add a time. I will say by 6 p.m. on February 3rd. And the reason I do that, this goes back to sort of setting some boundaries for your own life. Your buyer or your seller is waiting for that response. They are chomping at the bit and they are going to text you and bother you up until they get it. And so if you give another agent till midnight, they may send it at 11:30. So I like to personally put a time in. I will also usually kind of remind the agent like, hey, I asked for a response by 6 p.m. so that because it's not necessarily the norm. But I do that, just like I said, so that I can kind of manage some boundaries for myself, have some, not have a client that's anxious and not able to sleep that night because we haven't heard back yet. So that's just a little pro tip. The other thing I want to point out that is different than the purchase agreement, excuse me, if you send a purchase agreement or a counter offer and you don't respond, that counter offer or purchase agreement just expires. It is the exact opposite with inspection responses. If you do not respond on time, you have accepted. And so obviously that can be a huge thing if you've received a big response as a list agent and you missed the deadline, you have agreed to do all those repairs. So you want to be really careful of those deadlines and make sure that you're paying attention to them, that you have them in your calendar and you don't miss them.
Megan,
that said, yep.
Does that actually get enforced? Like if someone misses the deadline, like, is the agent on the other side typically like, no, you agreed to all of it? Like, how does that actually work?
I would say, I think it kind of just depends. I think usually if you catch it quickly, if you're like, oh, the deadline was midnight last night and at 8 a.m. the next day, I'm like, oh my gosh, so sorry. You probably can hopefully talk your way through it and negotiate through that. Kind of depends on the agent and the seller, or I'm assuming depends on, I guess, which side it is, but I wouldn't want to take the chance, I guess, is how I would answer that, if that makes sense. So, because technically, contractually, you have missed it. So, those were my kind of thoughts on that. So, as far as, so kind of shifting gears, kind of talk back to representing your buyers and what that means and what that looks like. Just a couple things. First of all, I just want to, I know some agents have different views on this, but I was always taught that you should always recommend more than one inspection company and not just give your buyers one company. And the reason for that is that if something goes wrong, you don't want to be liable for having chosen the inspection company. So I always recommend at least two. I can tell you I've done a little research, and when I send them over in an email, they almost always pick either who's listed first, or sometimes they'll pick based on price. So if you want to have a conversation outside of in writing and say, hey, this is who I would really pick, that's up to you. But as far as in an email, I've always got more than one option for that reason. I would just encourage you to remember that, okay, stop that. Time is really of the essence. And so even if you've written an agreement with 14 days for inspection, really encourage your folks to get that inspection scheduled as soon as they possibly can. And then once you've had that inspection, try not to take another 5 days to send a response. That seller is waiting. They're anxious. They're worried about what you found. So try to, as a courtesy to your other agents, the more you can set a positive tone with the other agent, the better the whole process is going to be. And then I would just remind you that ultimately what a buyer asks for is their decision. So it's not up to you what goes in that buyer's inspection response. You can counsel them and advise them and try to help them, but at the end of the day, it's up to them what they ask for. I can tell you I've sent inspection responses that I was embarrassed to send before, but it's ultimately up to them. What I like to do, especially if it's a doozy of one, you're at the inspection, they're going to get the report that evening. It's going to be 70 pages long. I'll usually say, hey, okay, take some time, read it, sleep on it. Let's talk tomorrow. Usually a little time helps digest some of it. So that would be sort of just some extra advice. Ask questions. Buyers are funny. You never know what they might be comfortable fixing. You never know whose dad is an electrician. You don't know what are hot spots for them. For example, mold for some people is a really big deal. For other people, it's just not as much of a concern. So the more you can kind of understand what's important to your buyers, I think the better response you're going to make. When you send a response to a seller, make sure you give them time. This is not like a purchase agreement. If you've asked for quotes or them to do work with 5 different contractors, you need to give them some time to call those contractors, get them out there. I would say typically a week response time is normal, but depending on the scope of work, that can be less if it's not that many items, but it just kind of depends. But this is why, going back to time, if you're on a 30-day closing timeline, if you've maxed out your inspection response time of 14 days, and then you give a seller another 7 to respond, all of a sudden you're at 21 days, and it's getting really tight to get those repairs done. So the quicker you can be on those steps, the better, less stressful for everybody. Every agent approaches this differently as far as how involved they are, I think, with the process, as far as, are you talking to contractors and Are you getting estimates? And I think I am really engaged, but it depends. Some sellers or buyers are way more independent than others. But I would say do as much due diligence as you can when you have a buyer. And what I mean by that is inspection reports are very general. And so if you can take time, for example, there's a weird plumbing situation in an old house. If you can take the time to get an opinion of a plumber before you just fire off your response, sometimes that's really helpful to get a little more information than just going off the inspection report. And that will come too as you have established more contacts with tradesmen. It gets to a point where you can call people and ask them questions with photos. They don't necessarily have to come out with estimates. That's helpful. And then, can't emphasize this enough, the more you communicate with the agent on the other side, the better this will go. And that goes throughout, obviously, the whole transaction. But for example, if I've had an inspection on Wednesday and it's Friday and I haven't sent a response yet, I'm going to tell that agent why. What's going on? Why are you guys waiting? Well, I'm trying to get more information about this, or we're trying to figure out this, or this is why we haven't talked yet and why we haven't gotten your response. The more you can communicate, the more you can tell them, typically the better it is. Because remember, they're anxious. They're worried about it over there. So what I was telling Rosie about was that I see these, especially as a list agent, I get inspection responses all the time that are ridiculous. And so I made some examples for you guys to look at, because I think this might be helpful. So let me get on this other window. Hang on. Just kidding, not there. I want to get in my inbox. Well, I need that little thing to move. 1 minute. Okay. So, not what I meant. Entertaining. Okay. So when you're writing your response, the best advice I can give you is to be super, super specific. And this is where like I said, I've kind of included some examples. These are actual examples I screenshot from inspection reports or responses I've seen just in the last year, for you to kind of get an idea of what I mean. So in this first example, and then I've just kind of included some bullets, like if you can, tell me what page number it's in the inspection report. Don't make me dig through the 80 pages. If you've gotten estimates, include them. Like any information you've gotten that can help me, the more you can tell a seller, the better. So this is an example of this agent said, masonry company to do this, this, and this, and all other items detailed. Well, what does that mean? And the reason that's a problem is because the seller may interpret that one way and may go forward and do these repairs. And then all of a sudden you're 3 days before closing and the buyer's like, well, that's not what I meant. I meant do this, this, and this. And so like, I think vague sentences like that are problematic. So I also included our response below. So what I did was I wrote back, okay, this is exactly what the mason's going to do. And you'll notice like, this is a really good example. In their response, they mentioned the chimney crown. I didn't mention the chimney crown. So we are not replacing a chimney crown. That's where it's not inclusive, right? That's where it's only what's in the seller's response. That's an example of that. But if you're not watching, you may miss that. And then like in this case, IPL did one of the electrical repairs. I went ahead and spelled that out and said, hey, IPL is going to do that. And the reason I did that is there's no receipt. There's no receipt from IPL that was done. So I can't show a receipt for that repair, but it's been done. So just again, being really specific. And I know it may sound really like I'm being nitpicky, but I think it just avoids problems later. So that's one example. The second example I have, this just happened to me too. This buyer basically sent a response and said, hey, replace the roof as recommended. Well, the house was a house with a detached 2-car garage. The inspection report did not mention the roof of the garage in any way. And so the seller replaced the roof on the house and not the garage. Now, granted, I think that's more important. The roof on the house is, say, is more important than the roof on the garage, but that garage still needs a roof, and that seller or that new homeowner now is in a position where, you know, it's probably going to cost her more to do a garage roof by itself than it would have just at the same time as the house. So again, seller wrote back and said, hey, we'll cover the cost of the house's roof. I said it in 2 different ways. In this case, we were working with some insurance and so forth to get the roof covered. That's why there's 2 options. And then this third example, there's nothing really terribly wrong with this, except like, one, when a seller looks at this response, they're like, what? And now you put them in a position where they've got to dig through this report, or you have to communicate to your seller and explain what are items 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 47. And it also makes it look like a really daunting list. So this is where, again, like as a list agent, I came back, we basically agreed to all of the work. I just wanted it spelled out very clearly what we were doing. It's not only helpful just from a standpoint of what are you doing, but I think it's easier when this is over to go back through and be like, did we do everything? I don't have to go back and look at the report again. It's way easier for a seller to digest. This is what I have to do than looking at the list above. And like I said, at the end, when you're providing receipts and documentation and whatever, it's just going to be clearer and easier to sort of follow up on. And then I showed you all these bad examples, so I thought I'd show you a better example. This is a deal that was a plat deal this summer, and just wanted to point it out because of a couple of things. I felt like it was pretty clear as far as like, okay, we want an electrician to do this. We kind of gave options like repair as needed or just tell us it's okay the way it is. And then these handyman items that really weren't big things in this case, but we said, okay, we don't care if you do them yourself. And if there's no receipt, can you just snap a photo that it's done so we can verify that it's done? And then the last thing, this is a buyer I've worked with several times, and I love it because she is really, she's not a nitpicker at all. Part of the roof was really old, but it wasn't failing. It was still doing its job. And that's always an interesting debate in inspections. So she basically said, hey, will you split that? Will you split the cost of replacing that roof? I know it doesn't have to be done right this second, but it's going to have to be done soon. And would you give me half instead of asking for the whole thing? And this is an example of an inspection response that was just accepted. They just accepted it. We didn't have to go back and forth a bunch. She replaced that roof about a month after closing because it started to leak. So she was glad she'd done that, but you know, that was a fair situation or solution to her. So, you know, the buyer's going to get the advantage of that new roof. So she was willing to pay for half of it. So it's clear who's doing the work. The expectations are clear, kind of a win-win approach is what I was going for there. So, and that roof's a good example. We see a lot of times, I just had this happen this week actually with a water heater. That water heater is 22 years old. That's an old water heater. Water heater works fine. There's no rust. There's no signs of any like malfunction or leaking or whatever. We went for it. As the buyer's agent, we asked for either money or a new water heater. I failed, did not get it. And that is a good example of it's old, but it's working. So just keep that in mind. And that we see that with furnaces a lot. Furnace is 25 years old, but it's still going and it's been taken care of. And I wouldn't expect a seller to replace that. So just something to kind of keep in mind. I just had a couple other bullet points. If you are having contractors get estimates, if you are involved in that process, if you are calling your electrician, if you are calling roofers, please make sure they put the estimate in the homeowner's name, not your name. We just, I think that just came up in another training recently, but from a liability standpoint, you don't want it to look like you're making that repair, you're paying for that repair in any way. So make sure that's a little thing, but to protect yourself. And then when you're working with buyers, I would just say, you know, to consider reinspection to verify repairs. Don't always rely on receipts necessarily. If it's something major, it might be worth it for that buyer to pay their inspector to come back out. I've had situations where last summer sold a house that all we asked for were plumbing repairs. And there were just some things about the transaction. I just had a bad feeling stuff wasn't getting done. Instead of paying an inspector, we actually paid a plumber a service call fee. It was less expensive to pay a plumber $75 or whatever it was to come to the house and verify the day before closing that none of the work had been done. But at the same time, we were able to say, okay, give us an estimate. He was on site, he gave us an estimate, and we were able to just get a check for that estimate at closing. So if you talk to inspectors, they will tell you that on re-inspections, oftentimes repairs aren't done or aren't done properly. So just something to keep in mind. Which brings me well to my creative solutions category. This is something I think that as you do this more, you get more crafty about ways to like work through weird situations. Sometimes a seller doesn't have the cash to replace a roof or a furnace or a big ticket item. So you have to get sort of creative. So I've listed some options there. Price reduction doesn't always work, but it's an option. So for example, if Rosie's buying a $150,000 property and it needs a $5,000 roof, reducing that price to $145 doesn't necessarily help her get a roof. She may not have $5,000 laying around to put a roof on that house. So it may not work, but for some buyers it will. So that's an option to think about. Closing cost credit is another like no-brainer. So right now buyers are writing pretty clean offers. They don't have a lot of concessions in them. So I've used that, like, okay, we're not giving them any closing costs yet. Let's give them $1,000, not do repairs, and be done with this. That's like putting $1,000 in their pocket at closing that they wouldn't have had, and the buyer can then go and do repairs. I listed a home warranty here because we all have different opinions about home warranties and their effectiveness, but that's a good option when you have the 22-year-old water heater, or the even better, the 40. I sold a house this summer with a furnace from 1981 in it. It worked. It's a hard argument to get them to replace it, but maybe you can get them to give you a warranty for the first year so that if it goes out within the first 6 months or whatever, your buyer at least has some coverage. Water heaters, I think, are the #1 thing replaced by home warranties. So that's kind of an easy thing. Now, a home warranty is half the cost of a water heater. So depends. A buyer might rather just have the money, but check to contractors at closing. So that's, you saw in my roof example, that's a seller that didn't have $6,600 for a roof. So we had a roof estimate, and we cut a check from his proceeds from the title company to the roofer at closing. That's a great option when a seller doesn't have a lot of money. All of those options, what I like about closing cost credit and a check and so forth, that puts the repair back in the buyer's hands. So as a buyer's agent, that's almost always a good thing, in my opinion. They can pick the contractor in some cases. They're involved in the repair. They know who's done the work. They know it's been done. It can be risky too. A roof is a really good example of when that's risky. When you get a roof estimate, typically roof estimates can go up once they tear the roof off and realize they need more decking. So you do have to manage expectations there, that a buyer's going to assume any additional cost above whatever check they've gotten at closing. But it does put it back in the buyer's hands, takes the stress off the seller, takes the stress of the timeline off the situation, because they don't have to have the repairs done within a certain amount of time. I've got a situation right now that had a bunch of masonry work, supposed to close next Friday. Like, we can't get a day warm enough to do the masonry work. It's not that the seller's not willing to do it. It's just that it's not going to work because it's 22 degrees or whatever. So that's a case where the seller will, at closing, give the buyer a check payable to the contractor for that work, and it will be completed in the spring when it's done. What you're not supposed to do, it happens, but what you're not supposed to do is hand the buyer money or a check to the buyer. And the reason for that is tied up in mortgage situations. Lenders don't like it when cash changes hands and repairs aren't done and so forth. It does happen, and especially agents that have been around a long time tend to do that and don't think twice about it. But you don't want your lender to know if that is happening. So that's something to keep in mind.
But Megan, you can give them a credit. You just can't like write them a check. Is that right? Or no?
Which doesn't really, I mean, it's kind of the same difference. But that's where like a closing cost credit, I can give you $1,000 towards your closing costs, but technically I'm not supposed to give you $1,000 cash. It's the same difference. It's because the lender wants a record of everything that happened in the transaction. So now it's on the settlement statement. Make sense? Kind of weird. Okay, and then my last, like, this is probably the most important stuff, but strategy is important, and it's just important in how you engage in this process, because other agents, I have a good example. There's another agent that is my neighbor. I went to junior high with him. We are friends. I don't want to do deals with him because I know how he is on inspection. So he's not a plat agent. So this does matter, like how you approach this situation. I think the best agents look for a win-win. They don't try to beat each other up. They really encourage your clients to think about, like, I'll say this, like the water heater situation this week. My buyer is like, I want a new water heater. And I was like, we'll ask. But I told him up front, if I was the list agent, this is what I would say from the seller side. Like, try to help them think about it from both sides. Try not to nitpick. Don't ask for the little piddly stuff. One thing I do is when a buyer's like, well, should we ask for this? Should we ask for that? I'll try to say, hey, let's wait till we have the whole report. We need the whole picture, because I'm not going to ask for, like, whether or not I ask for some things to be fixed just depends on what else there is on the list. I try to put, if I have a whole long list, put it in order. What's the most important? Communicate that to the other agent. The most important thing here is the water heater. They're a little worried about the windows, but if the water heater would be their number one priority. And then I wrote communicate, and don't rely entirely on text messages. And I know that goes against some people's like business practice, but one thing about negotiating is your tone matters so much. And getting on the phone with somebody, I think, can make such a difference, as opposed to relying on a text message. And making sure you're, like, I always try to communicate before I send a response. I don't just be like, here's the response. Try to be like, hey, here's where we're coming from. This is why this is important. You know, this person has allergies. This mold thing's really, you know, going to be an issue for them, or whatever the thing is. But, you know, the more you can communicate, I think the better, the more success you'll have. And then ask another agent for an opinion. And I think I still do this. Sometimes I just want to dig my heels in so hard for my people. Like, I want to protect them. But it's not always the best answer. Like, sometimes it just helps to kind of have a sounding board. Ask somebody else if your response makes sense, if you're being kind of too aggressive, whatever. There are a lot of plat agents that will help. And like I said, even with several years of experience, I still like to get other people's opinions on certain scenarios. So that's just something I would kind of keep in mind as you're navigating this. So that's kind of what I had. I don't know if there are questions or stories. I mean, there's lots of, I know there's lots of stories of crazy situations, but Rosie, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I have two things that came to mind as questions for me. One, I've heard agents talk about extending, if you need an extended response time, what's the appropriate way to ask for that?
Yep. There's actually on that buyer, so let's just assume it's the buyer that needs more time. There's actually a line on the form. So the 100% correct way to do it is to fill out that form, have a buyer sign it and say, we would like more time to whatever date. I think the language, even when I started, the language just said they have to request an extension in writing. And so you would get situations where an agent would just send an email and say, hey, we are officially asking for more time. So I think if you want to be proper about it, I would fill out the form and have the buyer sign the form. If you get an email that says, hey, we want more time, I mean, I think technically they're asking in writing, and that's probably okay. But if I was going to end up in a court situation, I'd rather have the form signed.
Yeah, that's great. The other thing that came to mind for me is you talked at the very beginning of this session about sometimes you have to write inspection responses that embarrass you because of what your buyer is asking.
Right.
Can you talk about, like, number one, like what is the situation where you felt embarrassed, and two, like, how do you handle that with your buyer or even with the other agent? Like, do you come to them and say, like, hey, I know this is going to be a lot, like, what is, kind of walk us through the dynamic of what that looks like.
Part of the reason, another thing about me, that's just me personally, like, I've always lived in a 100-year-old house. I have a very high tolerance for all the things that are wrong with 100-year-old houses. So that probably plays into some of my embarrassment factor. But what I mean by embarrassed is, I can't think of a really specific example off the top of my head, but like basically a buyer that is just insistent on asking for a whole bunch of little stuff, and it just feels ick. And not how I would normally, but sometimes, like I said, when I said it's ultimately up to the buyer, I'm representing them, and if that's what they really want. So I try to nicely manage expectations with the buyer as far as, hey, we can ask. Realistically, I don't think they're going to probably do all of this, and here's the risk you run of making them frustrated. And then I usually am pretty upfront with the other agent. So keeping in mind, I'm working for my buyer. I want to do what's best for my buyer, but what's best for my buyer is to keep that deal together normally, especially if it's little items, if there's not a major problem with the house. So I think it's to my buyer's advantage to call that list agent and say, hey, I know this is a lot. I've got a first-time buyer. They're pretty nervous. Now their parents are involved. They want all this stuff fixed. Can we at least like talk about it and like see what the seller, and like sort of set that stage of, I understand we're asking for a lot, but so that they don't think I just think that's the normal expectation, if that makes sense, when I send it. And that's where going back to, like, don't just send it, pick up the phone, call the agent, and be like, hey, this is why I'm sending this, and this is what's important, and here's where we are. Does that answer that sort of? Okay.
Yeah, that's so perfect. Guys, what other questions do you have for Megan? And just so you know, Megan, that PDF that she was reading through, we're going to send that out to you guys afterwards, so you'll have those notes as reference. But what other questions do you have?
Hey, Megan, I'll go. This is Eduardo. Great content. Thanks for sharing that. One of the questions for me would be, what if you do have the inspection you conducted, but at the time you get in there, there's no access to maybe the crawl space or the attic? Any recommendations on how to handle those? Are you just extended? Obviously, you get a request from the agent. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I've had that situation happen with the utilities too. Like if the gas isn't on at a house, and yeah, it's basically requesting an extension. I had one situation where a crawl space the house had been sort of remodeled to a point where there wasn't crawl space access. Like it was weird. That one was a little trickier. That one was kind of like, look, we can't get you in that crawl space without modifying the house. You have to either deal with it or, either you can live with that or you can't. But typically I would say that's just requesting more time. Yeah. And then making sure, because an inspector, even like if a crawl space access is screwed shut, whatever, they're typically not gonna unscrew something or whatever. So, and that's also on the list side, educating your listings, your sellers, to make sure they understand, like, hey, they need access to all these areas. And they need, to be able to see the plumbing and get to the electric panel. If you've stacked up all your stuff in front of it in the garage, like, that's a problem. So you can kind of work that from both sides.
Megan, we had a great question come in from Laura. She said, how do you talk to your clients about defects in relationship to their earnest money?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, how do you talk to your clients about defects in relationship to their earnest money?
Very carefully.
And maybe Megan, explain like what that question means, because
right.
I don't understand it.
Yeah, and I think, Megan, the reason I asked it is just because this is always the exiting point for so many buyers. And so how do you help people toe that line and having that conversation about what we're asking for, what's a true defect, you know? So
yep. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I do sort of dance, and that's not, I don't want to say that. I try to be as clear as I can, but the reality is the language in our purchase agreement is subjective. What you think is a defect may not be what a seller thinks is a defect. And I'll say that, you know, the language is not, unfortunately, there is no black and white answer. And so depending on what you've identified as a defect, if the seller doesn't think that's a major defect, you could be in a dispute about your earnest money, is what I would typically say. I try not to say things like, oh, if it's a major defect and they won't fix it, you'll get your earnest money back. I probably used to say that, and now I just try to be very careful about like, hey, you know, typically we can all agree on what some obvious major defects are, but depending on the situation, if a seller doesn't think it is, they could tie you up over your earnest money, and you could end up in a dispute, because it is. I mean, I feel like most of the time, well, I don't even know if I want to say that. I was gonna say, I think most of the time it's pretty clear if it's major or not, but, you know, I'll use the example of rewiring entire houses. Like, you know, people have very different views on that. And so it can be tricky.
Megan, question that just came to mind for me, is there anything that you explain differently or do differently with first-time home buyers versus experienced? I know when I was buying my first house, I was such an idiot about so many things. So yeah, anything that you would caution or suggest there for people?
I probably take more time to explain, again, the purpose of an inspection, that we're not looking for perfection, that part of being a homeowner is home maintenance and little projects, and sometimes even medium-sized and bigger projects. Part of my buyer consult is always asking them like what their threshold for home maintenance is. Are you the person that's gonna call somebody to do everything? Do you have some skills? Is your brother a carpenter? Is your, you know, like I said, is your uncle an electrician, whatever? So I think asking a lot of questions in advance can kind of anticipate some of those things. And then I think also asking like, hey, are your parents going to be involved in this process is important, because you can have a buyer that's 100% on board and mom and dad come to inspection and all of a sudden you're like in a mess. So sort of understanding that as early as possible, I think, is important.
That's so good. Guys, I could keep asking questions all day because inspections are like, they terrify me. I'm not even an agent and they sound just horrible. Eliza, do you have a question?
Yes, I just have a quick question, and you kind of hit on this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. I have an inspection Monday, and he's already, my buyer client has already expressed some concern about the old furnace and the older water heater. You know, they're both functioning normally as far as we can tell. We obviously have not had inspection yet. But how do you handle that? What do you typically ask for? Do you typically ask for, you know, I'm sorry, I don't really, this will be like my second inspection report.
No, that I understand what you're saying. So this is where every agent sort of develops their own style. And I was saying to Rosie when she asked me about doing this conversation, like, I'm not the most aggressive agent there is. I'm sure there are agents that will, if that furnace is 30 years old, they're going to ask for a replacement. If that furnace is 30 years old and functioning and the inspector can't identify a problem, I would probably ask for the seller to have it cleaned and serviced and show me records that it's in good working order at the time of now the purchase, and consider asking for a home warranty to protect my buyer going forward. If it's not broken, I don't like to ask for a replacement. If your buyer's really, really worried about it, you can try, like, that's where you might be able to ask for a replacement. Maybe you land in the middle and they give you the value of half of a replacement. But if it's in good working order, I think that's a big ask. Most home inspectors will say, have a licensed HVAC person come in and evaluate this, because they're kind of doing a quicker look. They're not like in it like an HVAC guy would be. So you'll probably in your inspection report have that language of, please have somebody come and look at it, say it's in. And that's usually like not expensive, $100 for a seller to do that. Or a buyer can do that. I mean, if your buyer's not comfortable with the seller doing that, you could take an additional day, or on Monday during the inspection, have an HVAC person there to look at it. But that cost at that point is going to be up to the buyer.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be prepared, for what I potentially think is something he's going to express concern about.
Yeah.
So,
and that's a big thing. And if a buyer's put all their savings into their down payment, that's a big expense in the first year or two. So
yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Eliza, congrats on having another buyer. That's awesome.
Yeah. I feel nervous about this inspection. So I was really happy about this training today.
Yeah,
So
good.
he's kind of handy. So I think he thinks he knows more than he does. And anyway, he's a very nice guy. I don't want to speak ill of him. But.
Another thing I always do before inspection is I always try to sort of set up, like right before inspection, like the morning of, hey, I know you're super excited about your house. This is about to be a bit of a downer. Like, this inspector is going to pick it apart. That's what you're paying them to do. Don't let it, like, totally bring you down. I mean, it's, again, you can't control how a buyer reacts entirely, but sort of setting that expectation of, I've been known to say it's like taking a Quaalude.
He is going to be there, which I think is great, because I think it'll be good for him to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Yep.
So.
That's also where, like, having a good inspector is important, and how they explain things to buyers is important, so that they're not alarmists and terrifying buyers. So.
That's so good. Lydia.
Yes, I have a question. What do you think about the market right now, where I noticed that they're not asking for inspections? Like, if you have an inspection, you are not like, what do you think? How can you handle that?
I'm going to try to answer that. And if I don't, just tell me. So, I do not encourage buyers to waive the right to inspection. I will say you can have it as is, and then you still have the right to have it inspected.
Okay.
I'm never going to encourage, personally, a buyer to just waive the right to inspection. Now, if I'm a list agent, absolutely. But I just feel like at least the buyer has the option. Like, so for an example, if you write a purchase agreement, it's as is, you still have a specified amount of time to have that home inspected. You just understand you're not asking for repairs. You don't have to have it inspected, but I didn't take away that option for them by recommending that they waive that right. But again, like I said, if I'm on the other side of it, yeah, if the buyer wants to waive the right, that's great. I thought about this actually as I was kind of putting together my notes, because it is it's funny. I see two things happening. I see that happening a lot of like either as is offers or no inspections, or I've heard of people writing in language like, look, we won't ask for any repair that costs less than $1,000. So you're establishing that it's a major problem if we're asking for it. I've also seen the flip side of, I just paid $20,000 over your asking price, so now I want all this stuff fixed, which I think is a little risky in the seller's market, because a seller could be like, no, and go back on the market and probably sell it again. But yeah, I would never tell someone to not have any kind of inspection. I mean, if they're a general contractor and they're comfortable, but I would make sure they knew their options before I.
So let's say that we do a contract with the as is form, and we get the inspection, and something, let's say the roof is not okay. Like, how do you present that?
Yeah.
If you already say as is, and you will not have the right to go and ask for repairs, or
you do still have the right. So my example of the roof situation actually was an as-is property this summer, and that seller didn't have a lot of money to do repairs. So we advertised the house as is, and we took an as-is offer. I actually, as the list agent, went to that buyer's agent and said, hey, if something crazy happens, at least let's have a conversation about it, and we'll see if we can keep it together. And as a buyer's agent, if I'm writing an as-is offer, it kind of depends. If the house has been advertised as is, I would probably have a conversation in advance with the listing agent of like, hey, I know you're saying as is there any room there to do some repairs? Maybe. But with the buyer, if I'm a buyer and they're writing an as-is offer in order to win in a multiple offer crazy situation, I will explain to a buyer, you have the right to ask for repairs, and the seller may work with you, but you should know that they may not. That they may say, no, you said as is, it's as is, take it or leave it. Oftentimes, if you're 2 weeks into a transaction and it's, maybe there's a solution, it's usually to the seller's advantage to work with you instead of going back out on the market, because even if you paid over list price or whatever, they're not as likely the second time back on the market to get the crazy offers, I think. So usually it's to everyone's advantage to try to figure out a solution. But yeah, you have the right to ask. You just shouldn't necessarily expect anything. But what I, as a list agent, what I don't want, I would way rather a buyer ask than a buyer have it as is, have an inspection, and just send me and in that case, you don't have to send a response. You can just send a mutual release. I'd rather have you send a response and let's see if we can work it out. So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Megan, we had a really good question from Karen. Karen, thanks so much for asking this. She says, I think sellers feel insulted when defects are pointed out. How do you take that emotion out of it?
That's a hard one. And I think especially like if someone's been in a house a really long time and, they raise their kids and they're leaving, and it can be really hard. I try to, I don't know. I think part of it just comes, maybe some of it just comes with experience of like, hey, this is really typical request. This happens in all these, this is really common that someone is going to ask for this to be fixed. I know it doesn't bother you and you don't see it as a problem, but it's typical. Sometimes I probably take on too much of the managing of the process to take that off of them. Like, for example, I'll call the electrician, I'll call the plumber, I'll figure this out and sort of take them out of it. And I feel like that helps to some degree because they're not in the middle of it and thinking about it and obsessing about it. Part of it, I think, too, is like setting back to, I know I keep saying this, but sort of setting that expectations with your seller. They're going to ask for something. I always say that. They're going to find something. No matter how well maintained your home is, no matter how new your home is, something's going to be asked for, and we're going to work through it, and we're going to find a solution, is what I try to sort of set the stage for in the beginning. So I don't know if I really have the magic answer for that one. I think that's a hard one. You're welcome.
That's good. Guys, any final questions before we wrap up? Okay.
Something that I
Lydia,
want
one
to
more?
share, last summer, one of my clients really want to buy this house here in Westfield, but they have all these offers. And I mean, she like, I explained to her how things were going, and she decided like to not have a home inspection. And I was worried, and I told her, I think we need to at least get a home warranty. So we ended up getting it. It was the summer, and probably a month after is when we started getting like cold weather, and the furnace was not working. So it did work out because she had the home warranty, but otherwise I was like, because she called me right away, my furnace is not working. I'm like, okay, here we go. And it's just like, I was worried, and I did explain to her, I mean, they might fix it, they might not. But she's like, well, my dad, he's a handyman, he knows a lot of people, so if it doesn't work, we will figure out. I'm like, okay. But I was worried when she called me. I'm like, I don't know if the home warranty, it will cover, but it did. And I mean, she's happy. I still getting more referrals from that family, but I was like, oh no. So it's something. I mean, if it is like as is a home warranty, it can save you. It can save you.
Yep. Little thing too on that, some home warranties are funny that I would tell people, if they have a home warranty, if the seller hasn't done it, to get that furnace serviced right away when they move in, because the one thing a home warranty company can try to do, some of them, is say, oh, we don't know if it was in good shape when you bought it, and try to kind of play the pre-existing problem card. So yes, absolutely it can work, but I do encourage sellers or buyers to do that right away. Like I said, it's usually about $100, and keep that receipt just in case there is a problem. So
can you share like home warranties that you use? I don't know, Rosie or you. I mean, just to make sure something that it have worked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Rosie has an opinion on what the brokerage recommends. I right now recommend Choice.
Okay.
I think I used to be a big HSA person, and then I had one bad experience, and I just got mad enough that I'm stubborn, I'm Irish, whatever. But I think there's probably stories about all of them that are good and bad, but I think, is the brokerage still Choice, I think, recommending with Amy? And
yeah,
Yes.
so Amy Drudge is typically who we use. I think what I appreciate about Amy is that she understands that home warranties aren't perfect, and she's very upfront about that. Like, home warranties don't always work out. And I think Amy is just like, they don't always work out, but I'm your person. Call me if something goes wrong, and we'll like try to get to the best solution. So yeah, Choice is who we would recommend. There's other vendors. I haven't met another one that I like. So Amy is the one that I would use.
Something that I want to share in regards Amy. We had a conversation with her, Shane and I, and she told us many times these home warranties can decline claims if it was no home inspection. So if they don't have home inspection, the home warranty can come and say, well, we don't know if it was good or not. So like, if you're gonna get a home warranty, somehow I guess you need to have a home inspection. That's pretty much how she explained that to us. I don't know.
That's not great, but I mean, if that's what she says, she's the expert. But that's where I think, like with a furnace, maybe if you'd had the furnace checked at a minimum, maybe that would help cover you in that situation. I don't know, but
Yeah, that's so good. Thanks for sharing, Lydia. Guys, I'm going to wrap us up. Megan, you are such a good agent, and this was such an amazing training. So thank you. Guys, thanks for coming. Intro to lending tomorrow. Hope you can join us. Have a great one.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Thanks, guys.